Good afternoon and welcome to this public meeting of the Standing Committee on Social Development. My name is George Nirasu and I am the MLA for Mackenzie Delta and Deputy Chair for the Standing Committee on Social Development. I will now ask members in the room and online to introduce themselves for the record, starting with on my left, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Kieran Testart. I'm the member for Range Lake. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Shauna Morgan, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Good afternoon. I am Kate Reed. I'm the MLA for Great Sniff.
Good afternoon. I'm Cheryl Yakalaya. I'm from the Decho, member for the Decho. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Jane Wayellen Armstrong. I am MLA for Montphy, Cleacher Region. Thank you.
Mr. McNeely.
Yes, good afternoon here. My name is Danny McNeely, MLA for the Sawtooth. Thank you.
Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. Robert Hawkins, MLA for Yellowknife Center. Happy to be here and yeah, looking forward to this discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Mr. Morse, are you online? Thank you. Thank you, members.
Thanks.
Pardon me. Oh, sorry, Mr. Morse.
Yeah, Julian Morse, MLA for Frame Lake. Sorry, Mr. Chair, just the mute button was acting up on me.
Okay. Thank you, members. Today we will receive a briefing on the JNWT's response to the encampment in Yellowknife from the Honorable Premier. Please note this meeting is being live streamed to the Assembly's social media channels. I would like to remind all members and witnesses to direct all questions and comments to myself as chair and wait to be recognized before speaking to help us have a smooth meeting. I will now pass the floor to the Premier. Please introduce your officials and proceed with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for inviting me today to speak about the government response to the tent encampments and more broadly unsheltered homelessness in the NWT. With me at the table, with you I guess, we have John McDonald, the Deputy Minister and Secretary to Cabinet, Rob Tordoff, Assistant Deputy Minister of Government and Service Integration, and Katie Sue Dureco, Territorial Director, Integrated Service Delivery, Government and Service Integration. Today's presentation will provide members with information on the encampment situation in Yellowknife at present, as well as how this work is situated within the broad mandate priority to address housing needs in the Northwest Territories. Executive and Indigenous Affairs is leading a whole of government approach to service integration. Service integration will be a new way of thinking about and working within the public service, using a person-centered approach where individual experience and service access are prioritized over bureaucratic convenience and policy barriers. It was determined that the best approach to service integration was to focus on a specific issue, homelessness, and the implementation of A Way Home, a comprehensive strategy to address homelessness in the Northwest Territories, was selected as a complex and pressing issue and is where we are starting our service integration work. The pillars of the homelessness strategy are community-driven solutions, needs-based services, shelter and housing, and planning. Through our work on the encampment issue, we have had the opportunity to collaborate on a number of strategic goals within these pillars, including combining efforts between 3 levels of government and the NGO sector, doing grassroots work to determine the needs of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, evaluating and building upon our existing shelter resources, working to anticipate ongoing needs and create supportive and transitional resources to prevent this from becoming a recurrent issue. Unsheltered homelessness and homeless encampments have been impacting every major jurisdiction in Canada. For every individual experiencing homelessness, there is a unique story. However, the past few years have provided a perfect storm of circumstances that have contributed to the level of unhoused people we are witnessing today. COVID-19, floods, and wildfires have put pressure on a population already experiencing shortages in suitable and affordable housing and increasing drug potency and toxicity. We are working on several initiatives to address homelessness and housing across the GNWT and with our federal and municipal partners. This includes short-term efforts to expand emergency shelter spaces to meet the need before winter, as well as longer-term efforts to increase supportive, transitional, and affordable independent housing options and reduce the pressure felt by NGOs and GNWT staff providing shelter services in Yellowknife and regional centers. While EIA is coordinating this work, the Department of Health and Social Services, the Department of Justice, NWT Housing, and the Northwest Territories Health and Social Services Authority lead service provision in this area and are essential in the work to plan and develop this capacity. While the encampment situation has been challenging for all involved, people, including people experiencing homelessness and addictions, neighborhood residents, and NGOs, it has allowed us to gain valuable insight into the needs of the encampment residents in unsheltered homelessness and build collaborative and work with multiple levels of government and NGO partners to meet community needs. It has also provided an invaluable opportunity to demonstrate our support for the NGO sector and build the relationships we will need to rely on to address homelessness effectively. With your permission, Mr. Chair, I would like to ask Mr. McDonald to lead members through the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So thanks for the opportunity to present on this important issue. I'll advance to slide 2, please. So this presentation covers a number of topics. We'll discuss the encampments in Yellowknife. We'll discuss the response that the GNWT and its partners have taken over the course of the last number of weeks and months. And towards the end of the presentation, bring back the connection to the homelessness strategy as well as to the mandate. Moving to slide 3, please. So on this slide, you see a graphic, and what it shows is the current situation within Yellowknife with respect to shelter capacity as well as transitional housing. And you'll see to the right side of the slide the number of unmet housing needs that we're currently calculating, which is in the 30 to 60 person range. It is a range because these numbers are fluctuating fairly regularly. I should point out that encampments are not entirely new to Yellowknife. They are an annual occurrence, but I think, as everybody would agree this year, the number, and perhaps one would say the visibility of these encampments has increased. And as the Premier mentioned in his opening remarks, there are a number of conditions out there that are leading to this increase in the number of people who are unsheltered. I'll move on to slide 4. So this slide speaks to some of the observations that have been made over the past few weeks and months. So even before this downtown encampment on 51st Street was established, there were acknowledgements from the NGO sector as well as various orders of government that there was some capacity challenges with respect to sheltering in the city. This was back in June. In late June, the city held a homelessness roundtable, which was a public meeting, and it was really meant to see what the various partners and stakeholders knew, what they were observing and experiencing, and share information. Later, in early July, EIA held a community partnership meeting, which was not a public meeting, but it did have NGOs, other agencies, various branches of the territorial government, and the vision for that meeting was to discuss better sharing of information to try to ensure that all of us had a better understanding of some of the challenges that various organizations were experiencing, and certainly individuals experiencing homelessness were experiencing, as well as to look at whether there could be mobilization of more coordinated efforts, for example, in service to seeking federal funding that could benefit everyone in the city. The consensus that arose from these meetings was that there is a need for supportive housing options. Just to be clear, I think all partners within this group have identified that while on a temporary basis more shelter space is going to be necessary, from a long-term perspective, transitional or supportive housing is that gap in the housing continuum that we really need to focus on. Moving to slide 5. This slide provides a bit of a timeline on the graphic. So here, the GNWT was aware of an encampment in the downtown core in July, and was communicating with NGO partners about the situation at that time. The encampment selected 2 sites that were on private property, which led to some potential conflict with property owners. And it was at that point where EIA stepped in to try to facilitate a relocation of the encampment off of private property and to support an NGO partner in that work. 3 potential sites were identified at the time. One was immediately adjacent to a school, and with the summer closing, that was deemed to be unsatisfactory. There was another site that was also in the downtown area, but it was located adjacent to facilities, after-hours facilities, and it was thought that there would be potential for conflict there. So the site on 51st Street was the other option that was selected ultimately. Definitely not an ideal option, granted, but one that was deemed to be the best of perhaps a number of limited options. On August 12th, EIA informed encampment residents that they had the option to move to this lot, which is in the possession of Housing NWT. So that was, it was clear at the time to the residents that that lot would be a temporary location because Housing NWT would need that location and their contractor for a project, a renovation project of an adjacent building. Moving to slide 6, another timeline slide. So by August 13th, all encampment residents had moved from the previous private owned location to the 51st Street location. And EIA staff, as well as NGO partner staff, began making daily visits to the encampment site to check on residents, develop relationships, share community concerns, and listen to their needs. The size of the encampment is estimated around 12 to 15 persons. That number has fluctuated over the course of the last couple of weeks, but that's still reasonably accurate. At the first visit with encampment residents, there were some requests that were made to EIA, including making sure that there be portable toilets available, garbage removal, and electricity if possible. So steps were taken to provide those resources to the site. And I should mention that when discussions were held with community members, there was also a desire to have those types of resources on the site because they didn't want garbage or other issues associated with the encampment. So residents of the encampment have been made aware of the circumstances, whereas Housing NWT needs this location back. So it's been fairly consistently communicated over the last couple of weeks that September 9th and 10th would be the time period where the encampment would have to be closed down. Moving to slide 7. So this slide speaks a bit to the interagency encampment working group that's been struck and established to respond to this encampment, but frankly to the fact that there are a number of other individuals across the city who are living rough. So this, you see the membership on that slide. It's a fairly extensive group with 3 orders of government, various agencies, NGOs, and it's been an amazingly productive group in terms of information sharing and relationship building. Beginning on August 14th, EIA convened this group, and it's been meeting regularly, so really on about a weekly basis to share information, plan next steps in relation to the encampment itself, as well as the planned closure of the encampment, but perhaps more importantly on future steps, which I'll get into a little bit later. So moving on to slide 8. As a result of this outreach, valuable insights into the individual needs of members of the group were identified. All encampment residents are able to access alternative shelters or other resources if they so choose, though some may opt to camp in a different location if the weather remains good for the foreseeable future. In working with the population, we've learned a lot, to be frank, and I think a lot of common assumptions that have been made were wrong. So for example, largely this group of people are residents of the Northwest Territories. All residents reported that they could access shelter resources, but that they chose not to because of shelter policies that required them to be searched for drugs and alcohol, for example, and did not allow them to store their possessions. So there are some policy barriers that have come to light as we've discussed this with our partners. And I just would stress overall that this working group has really been an opportunity for us to learn from some of our partners who are much more experienced in this space. It's been a really good opportunity to advance some of the pillars or actions within the homelessness strategy. On slide 9, we start to speak a little bit about next steps. So the immediate plan is really something that I would break down into some phases. So first of all, what we're doing is in trying to ensure a clear understanding of the needs and options available to encampment residents. Are individuals, for example, barred from a shelter? Would that preclude them from going back to a shelter when the weather is colder? Or are there other opportunities? Do they have shelter in another community if they could get to that shelter? Things of that nature. So there's been a lot of work done by EIA as well as NGOs to survey this group, as well as to make preparations to survey others across the city to help make sure that we can tailor our response. The next phase is to expand existing capacity on a temporary basis. So we do recognize that there are going to be some drops in temperatures here in the next few weeks, and we've been working with NGO partners to look at ways to temporarily increase their capacity to absorb additional unsheltered persons. But that is only a bridging mechanism. To be frank, the real longer-term approach is to address the availability of supportive housing. That's the gap in the continuum that I had mentioned earlier. So the working group has been working on this, and the work is underway. And I think there'll be lots of news as we're able to work through some of the variables around some of these longer-term solutions in the coming weeks. Moving to slide 10. So I'll be concluding shortly, but just wanting to connect all of this work back to the homelessness strategy. So things like coordinated access, provision of shelter resources, ensuring that there are transitional and supportive options within the housing continuum, as well as to improve data collection and sharing are all key elements of that strategy and the actions within it. And so despite this being a challenging situation for those experiencing homelessness, residents in the neighborhood adjacent to 51st Street, as well as NGO partners, there have been a lot of lessons learned through this, and I think that's going to stand us in good stead as we look to actually advance some of the outcomes in the strategy. And I'll close with just a connection to the mandate. So this does tie all directly to the GNWT mandate. So increasing housing availability, working with partners to address gaps in the housing continuum, as well as collaborating across departments and with partners. Those are two areas where this work has, I think, jump-started a lot of opportunities for that work to continue. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll hand it back to you and appreciate the time.
Thank you for your presentation, and I will ask members if they have any questions, just to make note that we're on a time restraint, so give you a question with a follow-up, and if needs be, we'll go back to a third round. Ms. Reid?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Premier and his staff for the presentation. This is a matter that's, I think, very urgent for our community. I don't think it, I know it. Nobody has missed what's going on in our streets, and the very serious situation that we are facing with a gap of shelter space when the weather is turning. So with that being said, we have received an open letter as MLAs from the shelter or the encampment residents and some of their advocates that has asked for questions. And I'd like to know if the government can respond to those questions, provide answers to those questions here today. And those are to provide the encampment residents with a list of suitable locations to relocate, provide the encampment residents with complete transportation to the new location or locations, that the GNWT City and other partners will provide a clear update on whether the government will ensure that there's adequate shelter space in time for winter, and finally, whether the GNWT City and other partners can provide each member of the encampment with a sense of their priority for shelter space. Can the government respond to those questions today? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To go to the Premier.
Thank you. I'd like to hand it to the Deputy Minister.
And Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, definitely aware of the open letter. The intention is to respond formally to the letter, hopefully today. The timeline for that response is in relation to the fact that we want to make sure that residents of the encampment on 51st Street as well as neighborhood residents are aware of our plans for next week, which are still to close the encampment. Off the top of my head, some of the questions from the open letter, I think when it comes to the location, there's no intention to establish another encampment. We have, as I mentioned in the presentation, we're aware of other individuals living roughly in other areas of the city, but we're not looking to establish another formal encampment. What we have done over the time that we've had this encampment is take advantage of the connection to, as I said in the presentation, survey those in it and to make sure we have a better understanding of what their needs and circumstances are. So we've been able to confirm that all of them have opportunities for housing, whether it be in shelter or family. So it's our intention to help them facilitate access to those, including shelters within Yellowknife at this point in time. We also will be doing what we can to support individuals to access those shelters should they so choose. But I would say that there are, as I mentioned in the presentation, there's the potential that some individuals will not choose a shelter yet, or they may have other plans, so we have to account for that as well. But as I mentioned, the intention is to respond to that letter as soon as today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Mr. Testart, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. And I'm somewhat disappointed that we can't hear the responses today, at this meeting, but I'll wait till later today to see the written document. So I guess my concern as well is that, I'll get to other concerns later, hopefully a second round, but I'm glad the working group is successfully speaking to different interagency to coordinate that response. But what has been lacking is communicating with the general public, in particular the landlords. So I've been contacted by every landlord in the area. I've spoken with the landlord of the previous property that they were moved from and the one before that. There was not a sense of who to call. I will say that the initial relocation to this site, I guess Site C, was met with great appreciation, including the response by the landlord, and the response of the government was appreciated, the quick response. But since then, there have been very concerning behavior that neighbors have seen. There's been theft of utilities that tenants in private accommodations now have to pay for, and that has to get worked out through their landlord. There's been open drug use. There's been sanitary issues before the things were put in, and at no point at that time was there proactive communication with the landlords or with the neighbors around that I have heard of. It was all, what's going on with this site? Can you please talk to me? And then there was communication. So how do we get we've got civil society represented in the working group through the NGOs. How do we get the private sector? Because some private sector leaders are on, like the mayor's task force, for example. During COVID, when there was during EVAC, when there was an interagency response, we had Northlands on some of those working groups. So there is a role for business to be a part of this and the private sector to be part of this? How can we bring them into your model of operating so they're not left in the dark and they can be part of finding the solution? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Mr. Premier?
Thank you. I'd like to direct this to the Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Mr. McDonald?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To the latter part of that, those statements, I do think that we can bring in civil society or the private sector to this work. What we found is, as we've learned of individuals or groups or organizations that want to be part of this or want to have access, we've added them. So that could be, JTFN, DND reps, others. So it's something where I think, given the complexity of the issue, our vision is that this working group continue and that it can expand or retract or have subgroups as required. So that's something that we're very interested in, recognizing that, as I said, due to the complexity of the issue, having more shoulders to the wheel would be helpful. During the encampment on 51st Street, we've tried to do, I think as a working group, is strike a bit of a balance in pushing out updates. We provided some, I think until today, 2 notices to the community, which we've shared with some landlords to make sure that they have that access and that information. We've responded to queries for information from MLAs, particularly MLA Reed, whose constituency this encampment is in, as well as updates to MLAs to help get that information out. And of course, through the working group, having each of those members go to their circles and share that information as well. We do intend to have another notice go out, hopefully by end of day today, just to make sure that there's more information about what we anticipate next week. But duly noted, I think there's always room for improved communications, and this has been something that I will readily admit we have no experience in. We've been learning as we go, and as I mentioned, learning together with our partners. So work could be done in the future, certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We'll go on to our next committee member, Ms. Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for this update. And I do appreciate that there is a tremendous amount of work that has been done over the past month or two on this, so I want to acknowledge that. And I also want to acknowledge the hope and opportunities that I think you've identified for new working relationships with NGOs and working with people who are in these situations directly. So I see that as a very positive opportunity, but want to make sure that we keep up the momentum and don't just kind of pat ourselves in the back and then move on to the way things were before. You mentioned that in talking to people in the encampment, you identified a number of barriers in shelters that were preventing people from being able to access them, around policies around being able to store things or being searched for drugs or alcohol. So first part of the question is, have those policies been changed, and does the government have the power to, if it's an NGO or a private sort of shelter, to ensure that policies can be more accommodating? And secondly, policies around how and when people might be banned for shelters and for what periods of time. I've heard, and I don't have verification of this, that the government-run day shelter and sobering center might ban people for months even at a time, whereas certain NGOs might have policies where there's sort of steps that are taken and then up to potentially banning someone for up to a week max. But has the government investigated or considered changing its own policies in the day shelter and sobering center around how and when and for how long people might be banned if there's disruptive behavior or things like that? Sort of a multi-part question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Morgan. Mr. Premier?
Thank you very much for the question. And we can't tell the shelter providers what to do. We can't change their policies for them. What we can do and what we are doing is building relationships, gathering information, finding out what the barriers are, and trying to work with NGOs to address those barriers. But for some more detail on this, I would like to pass it to Mr. Tordiff. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Mr. McDonald, or Mr. Morgan, sorry. Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the question. As the Premier has pointed out quite well, the working group that we have in place right now is really founded on a lot of collaboration, and we identify issues together, and through that define what the problems are and work towards solutions for those as well. We know that there's a evolving understanding of the needs within the homelessness population. This is not one homogeneous group. Folks that make up the unhoused present with a raft of various different challenges, and they're very person dependent on the individual's experiences, and so we try to resolve each solution individually as well. When it comes to shelters and shelter use, yes, we're working with the shelter providers. In some cases, it's identifying that there's policies. In some cases, it's identifying the mix of populations. And so that work, it takes a bit of time to really figure out, first off, how many people we're dealing with. And within that number, where those folks are best suited in terms of the types of programming that we can provide through ourselves, through the NGOs, and working then to fine-tune the types of policies and rules that exist within those shelters. So we're working on it now, and it involves, in the case of the Sobering Center and the day shelter, the NTHSSA, the Salvation Army, other groups that are out there operating shelters. So they're all part of that process. What we want to do at the end of the day is create an environment in which there's options for everyone that's unhoused that's going to require shelter services. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tordiff. Before we go back to Ms. Morgan, we'll go back to the Premier. I'd like to make an addition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for indulging me. I just wanted to reassure the MLA that we are not going to pat ourselves on the back and walk away. This focus on homelessness and integrating services predates this encampment issue in Yellowknife. This is an initiative that started late in the last government, and in this government, we are taking it very, very seriously, and that's why it has moved under the office of the Premier, so that we actually do have the authority to integrate services, whether departments like it or not. And so far, we have made a lot of progress, and I've seen a big difference between when the Department of Justice was leading integrated services delivery, and now with the executive leading that. There's much more collaboration, much more ability to get departments moving. So I just wanted to reassure the MLA on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. We'll go back to Ms. Morgan for your second question.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate that, and I do also see that there have been some changes in the way things are done, and I'm encouraged by that, so I just want to make sure we keep the momentum. But I don't think I heard a clear answer, so I want to follow up more on this. When it comes to the day shelter and sobering center, which I understand are run by NTHSSA, but I would assume that this government as a whole has at least a strong influence over policies on how those are run. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but can you confirm what are the policies around how and when and for how long people might be banned, and are those policies going to be changed in response to the needs that people have? And I also understand that shelter staff and users may have real concerns around safety and other issues that lead to these kind of banning procedures in the first place, but are there other ways to address those besides just saying, look, you can't come here, you're not welcome here? Thank you.
Morgan, go to the Premier.
Thank you very much. So the shelter policy issue, I guess, is on our radar. There's not consistent policies across the territory, and so it is something that we're live to right now. Staff are busy with this immediate issue, but I can hand it to Katie Sue for some more information on that. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. So in regards to the Day and Sobering Center shelter specifically, this is actually one of the lowest barrier shelters that we have that operates. So by that I mean the restrictions that are applied in only very serious situations, so very serious incidents of violence is usually when that happens. My understanding, and I've read the policies in depth, and a month restriction would be extremely long. It's usually a maximum of 24 hours. And in reoccurrence that happens daily, it's a maximum of 3 days. So I haven't seen anything, but I do know that they have experienced a lot of very unique situations they've never experienced in the past. The population's changing a bit, and so for the safety of residents that are using the shelter as well as staff, sometimes these situations need to happen where people are banned for a couple days, but it's definitely a large exception.
Thank you, Mr. Erko. We'll go on to our next committee member, Ms. Yakalai. Are you available?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Yes, can you go ahead with your first question?
Did I have my hand up somewhere? Okay, you mentioned, you talked about location, transportation, sense of priorities for encampment residents, and I heard you talk about solutions and options. What are the solutions for this encampment? And I wrote down something about a plan. What is the plan? What is the next steps? There's more than one question in my little talk here. Where are these people from? That's one question. Where are they from? The people that are living in this encampment, and has one thing I was thinking about was, were they encouraged to go back to where they came from? Or did they ask for support for that if they wanted to go? Say if you had somebody that was from Fort Providence and they wanted to come back here but didn't have a way, is there support to help them get back to the community they originated from in the Northwest Territories? Yeah, and that was one. And what are the options? And there's a whole bunch of questions in there, but that's the one I have for now. So where are they from, and were they approached to ask if they could relocate back to their communities? And has anybody spoken to the communities that they originated from to help assist with that? Or because this is not just a Yellowknife issue, it's the whole issue, that because those people are from some of the smaller communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yakalai. It's pretty hard to hear you, but what we got to it is saying that where these homeless people originated from, and have they been given any options of going back to their where they come from, back to their home communities. Mr. Premier?
Thank you very much for the question. There is funding available to help people get back to their home communities. Through Housing NWT, I believe the Homelessness Assistance Fund can do just that. As an MLA, I've used that myself, or I've worked with constituents to access that myself. The residents of the encampment are, for the most part, residents of the Northwest Territories. They're from the Northwest Territories. Often people wind up in Yellowknife. They come here on medical travel. Perhaps they're released from a correctional facility, and they wind up staying because they don't want to go back home, or maybe they're not welcome back home. So there's a lot of different scenarios, a lot of reasons why people stay here. I believe we have about 9 people who are not from Yellowknife. And so they come from regional centers and small communities alike from various regions around the territory. So the member is correct that this is not just a Yellowknife issue. These are the people from around the territory who wind up in Yellowknife often. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Ms. Yakalai, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. Now, given that information, what are the next steps? Solutions, what are the next steps that's going to happen to address this issue? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yakalaya. To the Premier.
Yeah, I'll hand it to the Deputy Minister. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. To Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, next steps, I think we'll take action next week. As I mentioned earlier, our hope is to communicate with residents of the encampment by the end of day today, as well as with the community in the area, letting them know that our approach next week will be to start to wind down the encampment on the 9th. That will involve EIA staff, the Integrated Service Delivery staff, as well as NGO staff going to the site and following up with individuals and encouraging individuals to go to shelters and register or to identify if they do want support for that homelessness assistance fund that the Premier mentioned earlier. We do intend to support individuals who would be looking to go to a shelter to make arrangements for some of their personal effects. We have learned over the course of this encampment that that's been a significant impediment to some individuals. So we want to provide that support as well. So that's really the immediate next steps for individuals in the encampment next week. The services such as the portable toilet, fencing, and garbage will be ending on the 11th. So we have created a bit of a buffer time there, and our intention is to make sure that that location is cleaned, as that has been a request from the neighborhood. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. I'll just go to each of the committee members. They're not obligated to ask a question, but I'm just going to see if you have a question. Mr. McNeely?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm really, I know of some individuals from my area that are out there. And I guess firstly, I've got to say thank you to the department and the Premier for taking a whole government approach to this issue. And you're right, there is solutions there. And I guess number one, I would say extending these services as identified in the slide to the let's say the unfortunate clients. The slide on response, the middle one kind of caught my eye here in saying explore alternative options for individuals. And I would recommend, if there's publication of a pamphlet to hand out to the individuals, to give them written material on the options available to them. Some of them are probably ideal clients for post-secondary education and further GED, but they're just caught in this cycle that is hard to get out of. But if we share information of options with the individuals, they might take it seriously and say, okay, I really got to get out of this situation that I'm in. And I agree with the government. Today's society is really disturbing to a large extent. We just can't keep building houses and shelters to accommodate a few. So there's a bit of rehabilitation there. And the rehabilitation would be passing on the pamphlets to give options to the clients that there is a healthier lifestyle out there. So that's my suggestion on providing pamphlets or written information to the clients. And I'm glad we're having this dialogue. It seems like we have more good ideas coming to the path moving forward to address the encampment. And the encouragement is, yes, we're preparing to help these clients before the winter weather sets in. we're already experiencing cooler nights here in our communities. And in the north there, I see on social media there's signs of snow up in the mountains, and across in Norman Wells there is the peaks of the mountains are covered in white. So it's coming. So I'm really glad to see that that timeline is being looked at as well. So sharing of information and alternatives, I think we can try to help on rehabilitation to the clients. And that is more of a suggestion at this point in time here, Mr. Chair. Mussy?
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Mr. Premier, would you like to respond to the statement?
Yeah, I think the members hitting on exactly what we would like to see happen is that we assist the individuals who are experiencing homelessness with getting out of homelessness. The idea behind things like transitional housing involves having supports available to individuals so that they can help them get past any sort of barriers that are keeping them out of, from being housed. There has been a lot of engagement with the individuals in the encampment. Staff have been down there having discussions, talking about options, working with them to ensure they have ID so that they can find accommodation if that is what the issue is, and these types of other things. So we've been helping them apply for housing, all of these types of things. So that work really is happening. And whether or not there are written materials or flyers being distributed, I'm not sure. I can go to the Deputy Minister for some information on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Premier. Mr. Premier, go to Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wouldn't call it flyers or pamphlets or things like that. We've conducted surveys, and so I had detailed questionnaires for each individual at the encampment. I think all but 2 participated in that. And NGO and EIA staff have also been working, as the Premier just indicated, to help with ID applications, applications for housing, to do taxes, so to try to remove as many barriers as possible while we have access to this group. So we're trying to assist every way we can, but not necessarily through public communication dissemination of materials like pamphlets. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. McNeely, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. As the Premier had mentioned, the holistic approach here, the interdepartmental approach on integrated services is expanded from justice to other departments. So if we're doing that, and all I'm suggesting is if we can have a 3-way folder or a 2-way folder on a pamphlet with numbers where to go for rehabilitation, we can leave that behind with the clients. So if they're sitting there wondering what options are available, at least we're sharing in written form a pamphlet that here is a phone number, a 1-800 number, here are some options of rehabilitation. I think that the message being left behind after the encampment visit will certainly give written material for the client to look at a later date. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Mr. Premier, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I appreciate the members' suggestions, and I'll follow up with the department. And NGOs are also providing support to the homeless population, and they have materials that they distribute as well. But I take the member's point. If the issue is that there may be individuals who want to get help but don't know where to go, then that's one of the easier things that we can do, is at least provide that information, even if it is just a phone number, and then we've removed at least that barrier. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Ms. Waylon Armstrong, if you're available, do you have a question?
Oops. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you to Premier and the Deputy Minister and all the other staff that's there. Yes, I know that majority of the unhoused or the homeless people in Yellowknife, and it's Mr. McNeely and Ms. Yakalai have mentioned, are indigenous, and they are either from Satu, Clecho, Decho, South Slave, and Delta. And we heard many times that many of these people, they moved to Yellowknife for a better life and to escape of all the social issues that that we have in small communities. And you did mention that in your presentation, there are 30 to 60 people are unhoused in Yellowknife. They are visible and invisible, and the encampment that we are discussing, or that's that just presented, that we did a presentation on. So in Clecho region, I know that we have over 200 people on housing wait list, and I have said this many times, and we have one shelter, and in winter it is full to capacity, and to date I have we don't even have a lot of housing available for many of the unhoused people. To date, I haven't seen any client from the shelter securing a unit in to local housing authority. And I know that talking to some of them, many of them want to get out, get away from the shelter. They want to have their own place, their own unit, but we don't have enough. We don't have accommodation. We don't have enough accommodation to accommodate the homelessness. And I even talked to some women here in my community, because of the overcapacity, especially in winter and then now in fall, many put themselves at risk of being assaulted by going to places just to have a place to sleep. And that is really wrong. It's really sad for me to think of our women. Our women are the foundation. We value the woman, and we keep hearing that from the government, and yet we put them at risk from being physically and sexually abused. And so with that in mind, I just want to ask the Premier, is there a timeline when GNWT will eliminate the homelessness in NWT? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Whalen Armstrong. Go to the Premier.
I don't think homelessness will ever be eliminated anywhere. There will always be situations where somebody, for whatever reason, doesn't have somewhere to go, where nobody wants that person. They burnt all their bridges, perhaps. So there's always going to be situations. This is not we're not going to fix this problem forever. It's never been fixed. It's always been an issue. That being said, it is such a serious issue now that the government has taken a different approach and put much more of a focus on it. We do have a housing shortage across the territory and across Canada. And so this is something that is being looked at everywhere. So maybe for some more information on this, perhaps I can go with the Deputy Minister and he might want to pass it off. As this is, it's not quite a question that can be answered, but perhaps we can dig a bit deeper into it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. We'll go to Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think I would echo the Premier in that this is a complex issue, so very difficult to tackle to definitively eliminate homelessness entirely. We often talk about a concept that we call functional zero, which is it's not elimination of homelessness that people would experience, but we do want to have sufficient capacity across our housing continuum and our support systems to be able to address people's needs where they need it and at the appropriate point in their life cycle. So, to use an example, we do want to ensure that for those individuals who have been perhaps in a shelter for a long period of time but are ready for supportive housing, that there are options for them to leave a shelter, move into a supportive housing situation where they can get supports and programming that can help them reduce barriers, and then hopefully allow them to move into something like public housing. So that's really something that we try to focus on as part of the homelessness strategy. And I will add that this government, through the mandate, has really set it's one of its number one priorities really is around housing, and a sub issue of housing is homelessness, and that's been something that is I think a shared priority with the current federal government, given some of those national conditions that the Premier indicated, and is one that Indigenous governments across the territory are speaking a lot about as well. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Go back to Ms. Whalen Armstrong if you have a follow-up.
Okay, yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, it says here in that presentation, NWT already has highest per capita shelter beds in Canada. And we talked about, and you mentioned the next step, and Ms. Yakalai mentioned the next step, and I think the next step is to build more houses in small communities. If we focus more on small communities, then many of our people don't have to go to Yellowknife to escape what's in a small community are going through all the social issues. But if we build more houses, because we know that the housing policy as it exists, and I mentioned that, I said that yesterday too as well, that if we it created a lot of homelessness. But that needs to be fixed. The housing policy needs to be fixed, but we need to build more houses so that we can eliminate the homelessness or unhoused people, because there is visible and invisible, and there are a lot of people that are couch surfing because of the overcapacity of our shelter. A lot of them are couch surfing, and that's where I said a lot of women put themselves at risk. I know that we can work towards it. We can do something about it, and we need to involve and work with the Indigenous government to do something, because we need to help and protect all the vulnerable. Because some of these kids, a lot of these unhoused people have children because they don't have a place to go, so the children are in care. So how many of those children are in care because as a result of parents do not have a house? I think we need to start focusing on building more houses. That's a next step. That should be a must. And so Yellowknife do have to be dealing with all this. And but I know that in small communities we need to focus on building more houses. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Whalen Armstrong. Go to the Premier.
Thank you. And, we obviously need more houses. I think everywhere in Canada needs more houses for the most part. And again, I want to caution people from thinking there is a silver bullet that is going to solve the issue. Sometimes access to housing isn't the reason people are in Yellowknife on the streets. There could be other issues. But the government is working with Indigenous governments on the housing issue. Through the Council of Leaders, the NWT Housing Forum was created, and that is a co-led forum with the GNWT and Indigenous governments, where we actually sit down and talk about these very issues. It's rare, I won't say it's rare, but often people don't go right from homelessness into a home. There's often a need for a transition period, giving people the skills to maintain their own home, do what they need to do in order to live independently. And that could be living somewhere where there are supports available so that they can get to the point where they're living independently. So while we do have a lot of shelter beds, we're also looking at transitional housing, so that the people who are in the shelters who are ready to move into transitional housing, and we know there are people who are ready. We talk to the shelter operators, and they know which clients would be good to move into transitional housing. Then that opens up shelter spaces as well. So we really need to look at the whole continuum and focus on the areas where we think we're going to make the most impact most quickly, I would say, because we talk about being outside on the streets in Yellowknife in the winter. Clearly, there's a need to get people housed very quickly. And perhaps the Deputy Minister has more to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Mr. McDonald?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the Premier covered a lot. The only thing I might add would be just about the approach to advocating for additional federal investment in housing. I think the territorial government and Housing NWT in this case as the lead really is looking to partner with Indigenous governments. So building on what the Premier said around the NWT Housing Forum, the territorial government and Housing NWT, they're happy as long as any federal investment comes in. They're not looking to be the ones administering that. They're advocating to have that investment go directly to Indigenous governments. Indigenous governments are taking on, doing amazing work to develop market housing in their communities, meet their own needs, and that's creating opportunities for the territorial government to focus on things like public housing or homelessness. So I think as time evolves, there will be greater opportunities for partnership, but that's something I think I wanted to add because we do recognize, as the MLA mentioned, that we need to be tackling this problem upstream. It's not just a Yellowknife situation. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. As Chair, I would just like to ask one question before we go to other members of on our list here. I've always stated in session in our committee meetings, and I've always used myself as an example too, because I was in this situation and I know what everybody goes through. They're not always going through addictions. They're surviving from one day to the next. And I've lived that life, and I see it now right in my own small community of less than 1,000 people. And they have no place to go. Even this, during my term, they feel I'm obligated to help them in this role, and they're sometimes sleeping in my place. A one-bedroom apartment has people sleeping in there, and it's pretty hard to turn them away. And I've often stated that, to hit the root of this problem, it has to come to the communities, because I know the people there, my chief knows the people there, the mayor knows the people there. So it has to come to the communities to try to help resolve these social development problems. I'm just wondering if there's funding, if there's resources, if there's any availability for the government to reach out to the smaller communities like Fort McPherson, for example, and see if Fort McPherson can help get some of their people back from Yellowknife and from Inuvik, because I know there's people here in Yellowknife and that belongs home, because that's where their culture is. So I'm just wondering if there's any plans to reach out to other communities, because my chief would like to help, but with the limited financial resources or even resource people that's available, she's stuck. So she comes to me, and so this is my opportunity to ask: is there any availability plans or any resources to reach out to the smaller communities to see if they can help to get their people back? Thank you. We'll go to the Premier.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I will just hand this off to the Deputy Minister for comments, and he can pass it to other staff if you would like. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Go to Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And absolutely, I think the objective for the government is to be working with all communities, small, medium, and large. Housing NWT, when it comes to housing in general, is the lead agency within the government on this file, in service to the mandate and the priority for housing and increasing the amount of housing available. The minister responsible for Housing NWT is working on this. The Premier has provided a mandate letter to expressly make this a priority. They do have existing programs for which they flow funding when funding is available to communities and work in partnership with communities. And as mentioned, there is a housing, NWT housing forum, and Housing NWT is in the process of working with Indigenous government and organization partners to schedule that next meeting, which I expect will be later in the fall. The date hasn't been determined yet, but I would suggest that that table would be a wonderful place for any community leader, Indigenous government leader, to send officials and be part of that conversation, because working together to try to look for opportunities for efficiencies, to advocate to the federal government, it seems to be the way to go, and have Indigenous governments working in tandem with the public government seems to be where the most opportunities are coming from. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Just for clarity, I should have made myself a little clearer too. Rather than having our residents of our smaller communities going to the larger regional centers and Yellowknife, can the government advocate on the community's behalf and build a shelter in the communities? Because our people seem to be going to the larger regional centers just to find accommodations, because they're like Ms. Wayland Armstrong stated, there are a lot of people in the smaller communities who are couch surfing. But if they have a shelter within the smaller communities, maybe we can keep some of our people home. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have made myself clear. Go to the Premier.
Thank you for that. So there is funding available for communities to look at creating shelters and providing those services. The government of the Northwest Territories is not looking to build and operate shelters in communities, but if there's a community group who would like to take this on and spearhead this, there is funding that's available, and we can assist with funding from helping communities access funding from the federal government as well. So our ultimate goal is not to just increase the number of shelter beds. It is actually to get people into stable housing situations, though. But I take the member's point. Mr. Chair, I take your point. There are needs in communities for shelters. Here in Hay River, we don't have an overnight shelter at this moment, and we have a homeless population here that's relatively significant. So I feel the stress, and as an MLA, I know that feeling that we need to do something, and so I'm working on my end to make something happen in this community as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. We will go to a second room. The Premier stated that he can stay till 3:30, so we can just go on to Ms. Reid.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the Premier and his staff for the presentation. First and foremost, I want to say thank you to the patience and compassion of the neighborhood on 51st Street, the folks who live there full time. They've been more than accommodating in their conversations with me about the encampment. I also want to thank the open dialogue that I've had with the Premier and his staff on this issue since the encampment moved in. However, I do think that there's some things that are still outstanding that we need to discuss. In your opening remarks, Premier, you spoke about service integration and having action over bureaucracy. We heard about the ad hoc working group being focused on information sharing and relationship building. And, these are great things that are happening. I'm really glad that this has been instigating a good relationship with NGOs and other partners to find middle to long-term solutions. The problem that I'm hearing from my constituents is that the immediate urgent needs that they're trying to understand for the health and safety of the neighborhood were not really well addressed. 2 flyers in 3 weeks is not really enough. In your own presentation, Premier, you note that there were 12 days that went by where public defecation was normal. I'm still having stories relayed to me about public sex happening in people's backyards and people feeling unsafe in their own homes to the point where they're buying security systems. So what can we do together, your staff, myself as the MLA, or any of our MLAs that might find themselves in this situation, to help put residents' minds at ease? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reid. We'll go to the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know when I'm in Yellowknife, I stay right downtown. And so, you know, what the MLA's residents are experiencing is something that I've seen for years, and other residents of Yellowknife have seen for years as well. So this is not something new. This is, you know, something that it's a reason that we are in this position. I'll say we as the government of focusing on homelessness is because this is not a new issue. This is an ongoing issue that people are dealing with. There is no silver bullet for it. It might be, you know, I get the safety issue. You know, my spouse, a little hesitant to come to Yellowknife and stay at the where I stay because of the issues downtown. So it's yeah, I guess we can't put a fence up around people. You know, we can't put people in a pen. People exist. They live out in the world with everyone, right? And we have to make space for everyone. It's not always pleasant, but perhaps I'll go with the Deputy Minister for some more technical information. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. We'll go to Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I hear the MLA's frustration in her voice, and I know, you know, we've responded to requests for information from her office over the course of this encampment, and yeah, I think it's not an ideal situation, and I would be the first to admit that we haven't, you know, communicated perfectly. As I mentioned previously in the presentation, we're learning in real time, and I think, you know, if I had it back, we would have done a few things differently. You know, we know that it's a very delicate situation to balance the needs of those who are in a vulnerable situation, such as those living unhoused, with community members living in a near adjacent community. So it's a difficult balance to strike, and you know, I think we've tried our best, but we admit that there's more that could have been done, and ideally, if we had to do it again, we would do some things differently. That being said, I think our goal is not to have encampments. We don't think that they're a solution. They're not what we want to see, and we don't want to have to be in a situation where we have to get better at this. We want to be finding systemic solutions. So that's where I think we're also trying to focus on some of the positives that have come from a very difficult situation. So I'll just end by saying, you know, certainly my empathy with your constituents and residents of the community. I know that it's not an easy period of time for them, and we're looking to wind this down next week. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Ms. Reid, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for that answer. It's frustration at a whole, not frustration at anybody in particular, but thank you for that. My second question is slightly different, and I want to thank my colleagues, Ms. Whalen Armstrong and yourself, Mr. Chair, for bringing this up already. You know, invisible homelessness is something that I have become more familiar with over slightly prior to my time becoming an MLA. It doesn't factor into the presentation around the 30 to 60 unsheltered residents that we're speaking about here today, but we are talking about the bigger picture here today as well. You know, couch surfing means we're maxing out residential spaces, full families and 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom homes here in Yellowknife and in small communities. So I'm curious, what work are we doing as a government with NGOs and our partners, Indigenous governments, to understand a real-time count of people who are living in situations that are untenable? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Reid. We'll go to the Premier.
Thank you. I will pass it to the Deputy Minister. Thank you.
Premier will go to Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, MLA Reid, for that question. That's another example, I think, of positive partnerships. So here in Yellowknife, the city will be the lead on that count, and I believe that will be in October. And Housing NWT has volunteered to take that work on for other communities across the territory. So we're working with partners as well as with the federal government, the Department of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities Canada, to make sure that we have this information so that all of us are working with better information so that we can make better decisions. So that work will be going forward this fall. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. We'll go to Mr. Morse. If you have a question, go ahead.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I wanted to go a little more high level than just the this encampment for today. So my first question I wanted to ask is, has NWT Housing themselves considered working with NGOs and or health and social services to provide support services in public housing units? Have they considered that kind of collaboration?
Thank you, Mr. Morse. We'll go to the Premier.
Thank you. I don't have that information. I will have to see if the staff have that, and I'll ask through you, Mr. Chair, to go to the Deputy Minister.
Mr. Jericho?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually don't have that information as well. I think that would be better directed towards Housing NWT. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. We'll go back to Mr. Morse. Do you have a follow-up?
Thank you. Yeah, I would just, this isn't my follow-up question, but I would appreciate if the Premier could take that as follow-up and follow up with us afterwards in writing on that question. The next question is, I've noted that throughout the presentation today and during the discussion, there's been mentioned a number of times of supporting housing options and the fact that we need more options available and an increase in supportive housing. So my question for the Premier is, what is the plan for increasing the offering of supportive housing in Yellowknife and in the territory? Have you identified a timeline and budgetary needs that you're going to be bringing forward for consideration by MLAs?
Thank you, Mr. Morse. We'll go to the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and that is exactly what we are exploring right now. It's clear that there will be funds required to address these issues, and so we're looking at avenues for funding, whether that is federal, whether that is, I won't say finding that internally within EIA as we are maxed out, but there are options for finding that internally within the government. But that's happening now. So I don't have a timeline, I don't have a dollar amount, but that's the work that is currently being done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. We'll go to Mr. Hawkins. Do you have a question?
I do, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. Let's see here. Okay. So just quickly, capacity of the shelters looks full, identified 30 to 60 unmet. So I guess my question really is built around the individuals, sort of in similar line to Ms. Yakalaya. So what discussions specifically are you having with these individuals? And can you give me some examples about potentially returning them to their home or working with community governments to welcome them back to the community area or the region? And are you providing solutions such as funding or other type of supportive mechanisms? And as such, what would they be specifically? Because I mean, all I hear is a lot of platitudes, which I can appreciate, but I think I, including the members and the public, are definitely looking to hear specific examples of how we're meeting this option, because Yellowknife cannot be the base or singular solution to this problem. So, and I know community governments and communities wish to be a partner. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. We'll go to the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as I mentioned, there is funding to transport individuals back to their home communities if they would like to go back to their home communities. There's obviously sometimes issues that would cause them not to go back there. I can go to, through you, Mr. Chair, if you wouldn't mind, we could go to Ms. Katie Sue to answer this question. She has more granular information on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Mr. Katie Cole.
Thank you. Yeah, so there's various outreach teams that have been working both with this specific encampment population as well as other unhoused individuals who access the shelter to kind of ensure, as we've discussed previously, that they're aware of the options that are available. So we've mentioned the Homelessness Assistance Fund. That is money to support individuals to go to any location that they would have housing. So they don't have to go back to their home community if they found housing with a friend somewhere else in the territory. They can go there. If they have housing down south, if they're from down south, we can send them there with that money. So that's available. Of course, individuals have to want to relocate, and that's something that's really important. I think we've mentioned it here that people are here for various reasons, and sometimes, people want to be in Yellowknife for different opportunities and don't necessarily want to leave. So we have to remember that it's individual choice as well. We also have done some surveys with individuals to understand what barriers they're facing and are working through these situations with them. And so we've identified whether or not they've been barred, as we've discussed already, from sun shelters and why, and we've been working with those NGOs to determine what the options are to either reallow these individuals access to the shelters, if it needs to be an agreement of some sort, something that makes both the NGOs operating the shelters comfortable as well as something that could be agreed to by the individual. We've done that. We've spoken to people about family options and whether those are available and what they'd like to do there. We've gotten everybody up to date in regards to all of the documentation required to get on any kind of housing wait list, whether it be market, public housing, any of the supportive housing programs. There's a lot of documentation that's required to ensure that your package is complete if something comes up. So we really want to ensure that everybody has all of that information. It's all up to date and ready to go. We've provided an information for, in Yellowknife, the Adult Services Group, as well as the ISD team to say, here's where you can come if you want an update. How can we find you? Would you like to share your information with us? So that if they're on wait lists and we get these updates, we can communicate it to them. So there's, depending on each individual situation, there's been a variety of things that have been done. We've also already accommodated 2 people from the encampment. We're able to find accommodations. And that was actually a really unique situation because they were exceptionally hard to house because they had a pet, and that's a big barrier. And so it was a success in that instance. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Derico. Mr. Hawkins, do you have a follow-up?
Sure do, Mr. Chairman. Just a different area, but no less important. It was mentioned that the encampment is winding down on the 9th. The last witness just excellent statement saying people don't necessarily want to leave. I'm going to dub that tail into the other comment made earlier at the start of the presentation. There's no intention to start encampment 4.0. That's my number, not anyone else's. So, noting the shelter conflict issues, such as people being banned, not wanting to follow through on substance checks, etc., or other types of issues, and noting people have mobility rights in Canada, what is the intention of the government to do if they want to set up an encampment somewhere else, or they just don't want to leave? I'd like to specifically know what the plan is if they don't leave on the 9th, or if they just say move across the street as an example. What is the intention specifically, how to address that? I mean, you must be planning for those types of contingencies, and if so, I'd like to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. We'll go to the Premier.
Thank you. So there are other encampments in Yellowknife, not so public, not maybe so big. So there are other places for individuals to go, but this is not a situation where we envision having to, bring in law enforcement to haul people off forcibly. The idea here is to treat people like people, work with them as individuals, and address their specific issue. So far, it's been a relatively good working relationship with those in the encampment. There's been a good back and forth, give and take. And so I fully expect that will be the case going forward. But, there's always legal options, injunctions and whatnot to address any serious issue, anyone who just won't want to leave. But, once that lot starts to be used for, the storage of construction materials and the marshalling yard for a construction project, it's not going to be a pleasant place to live anyways. So, but I'm confident that we will have this issue addressed. And they have stated through that open letter that was referenced earlier that they are willing to leave and work with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. That concludes our first round. We'll go to our second round and just limit it to one question so we can try to get everybody asking question before 3:30. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll make it a big question. So, like, I know whenever we have these hearings, we always kind of weigh into the existential issue, which is the important one, because that's the root cause question. But we keep hearing this language of, there's no silver bullet. I don't think we're looking for a silver bullet today. We're looking about what are we doing about this very specific problem, and how is the government resolving it expediently. What we've heard largely, except some granular detail, is that, are not urgent responses. Exploring, expanding, working towards, these are not tangible solutions that are going to give comfort to our residents that these people are going to be housed humanely or sheltered humanely when the cold weather hits. So just fundamentally, do we have 15 to 25 shelter spaces lined up, ready to go? And to the open letter, 4 of the residents signed on to that letter. I don't know if it represents the entire group. And I think some of those people are already housed, from my understanding. So from the point in time count, do we have those spaces lined up, or are we shutting down with no place for these folks to go? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. We'll go to the Premier.
Thank you, and I appreciate that the member is sticking to the topic of this particular briefing, but there have been higher level questions that are not specifically about this specific issue, very broad questions about how we're going to end homelessness. And so, in my responses about silver bullets and whatnot, I'm addressing those. There is work happening on the ground. There's discussions happening. The work has happened to get the encampment where it is now from a different location. So I'll go to the Deputy Minister for some more information on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. We'll go to Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do believe, as we've mentioned earlier today, that everyone in that encampment has a shelter opportunity. But again, whether everybody makes the decision to enter into shelter or avail themselves of a program such as the Homelessness Assistance Program, that is something we cannot guarantee. In terms of concrete plans, we are looking to expand our efforts to other individuals across the city so that we can survey them and, as I mentioned earlier, get more detail about their circumstances so that we can, to the degree possible, improve our understanding of that 30 to 60 unhoused individual number that we referenced earlier in the presentation. We are working in parallel to addressing the needs of this shelter population, to working with the NGOs and partners to expand their services or their capacity on a temporary basis. So we're looking at, for example, how can an NGO create an additional number of beds for the fall as the temperature drops, so that we have additional capacity should some of those other people in the city need space on a temporary basis. And we're looking at other options as well, trying to be as imaginative as possible to make sure that we have the shelter capacity that we need as a temporary bridging mechanism. Going forward, the plan is to leverage these partnerships to create options for transitional housing. That is, as the Premier mentioned earlier, going to require additional resources. So again, there is work underway within the government to seek those resources, and we've been working with our federal partner to advocate for additional resources. And we've been able to have some success with that to offset territorial investments. So I think, as I mentioned towards the end of the presentation, our goal is to have some real concrete steps and measures taken to be able to announce those, but we don't want to get ahead of our skis on this because in part it's resource dependent, and in part it's because we have partners that we're working with and working through, and we don't want to be out in front of what they're wanting us to say as well. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. We'll go on to Ms. Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I know that we've seen in the news and we've heard that NWT housing in particular is increasing its enforcement and policies of trying to remove people from public housing who are known to be dealing drugs or threatening safety of other residents in public housing. And so we've seen more evictions. And so that leaves people, without shelter or housing, who may be, in many cases, using drugs, sometimes dealing drugs. And we also have heard from people running shelters like the Salvation Army that increasingly they're dealing with, a minority of people, but a significant number of people who are more aggressive or using more violence often towards other shelter users. And so I'm wondering what are the strategies, or is there a plan on how to deal with a particular sort of subsection of the unsheltered population who, and it may often be related to drug use, where people become very unpredictable, aggressive, violent, have these kind of behaviors that's really hard to figure out how to keep them safe and keep people around them safe. And so there's no sort of necessarily easy solutions, but are we addressing that directly in terms of, do we need special services or special supportive housing or special sort of harm reduction, either supportive housing or centers that directly addresses that people may be both using drugs and exhibiting sort of dangerous behaviors? Do we have those kind of resources and tools, or do we have a plan to put those in place? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Morgan. Go to the Premier.
Thank you. Perhaps I'll go to the Deputy Minister. He can redirect it if he needs to for this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. I'll go to Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think member raises a very challenging question, absolutely, and one that we're hearing from NGO partners about. I think there's various ways to try to address this, and none of them are, I think, straightforward, but one would be what we're hearing from NGOs is as they reach their upward limits of capacity, they need more money. They need more financial resources to enable them to, for example, increase their staffing ratio and create a safer space for their employees and for their clients. So that's an example. Another one that we're paying close attention to as we undertake the work that we've discussed here today around our plan to increase supportive or transitional housing is to avoid putting all of our eggs in one basket. So, for example, we don't want to have only one option for say a shelter or for transitional housing. We want to be able to have options where we can have different groups with different particular needs be directed so that there's less chance of conflict, and so that in the context of supportive housing, supportive services can be deployed that meet the needs of those individuals. So that's another example. And as the Premier mentioned earlier during this briefing, that we do have an eye as part of the homelessness strategy on some pretty comprehensive policy work that's going to have to come once we're in a position to stabilize this sector. And really that's about setting up the conditions for equity, for better standards and consistency from shelter operator to shelter operator. So I think there's a number of things that are both more on the immediate term and more on the long term that we're going to have to be doing to address that challenge. And I will stop talking I couldn't mention, the enforcement side is a critical piece when we're talking about crime. And so RCMP, municipal enforcement, those partners are involved in some of this work for sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. We'll go to our online members. Just call your name, but you're not obligated to ask a question. Just try to get right to the question. Keep your preamble short. Ms. Yaklai, do you have a second round of questions?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for everybody participating and taking the time to really ask these questions. One question I have is, what is the timeline for all of the solutions, and when is everything going to be actioned on? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Akalaya. Go to the Premier.
Thank you. I'll pass it to the Deputy Minister. Thanks.
Thank you, Premier. We'll go to Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With respect to the encampment on 51st Street here in Yellowknife, we're looking at closing down the encampment on September 9th, so early next week. We are looking at bridging solutions by largely expanding temporary shelter capacity between now and December, January range. And post that, we're hoping to make progress on some of the transitional. So that's more of the long-term objectives. So those are really the timelines that we're working in within the confines of this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. We'll go to Mr. McNeely. Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank everybody that participated here. I feel the passion for solution in the atmosphere. To be quick to my question, if we look at the GNWT mandate on the flip chart or the slide, there's a few things that would address the chair's suggestion on transitional shelters in the communities. If you look at Fort Good Hope, for example, there's a agreement between housing and Yamoga to provide that building. It's up and running. They're operating it. And so there is solutions out there so that we don't have further encampment 51s. Is there any appetite moving forward after this discussion to have regional workshops on homelessness and housing partnerships in the regional centers and inviting the surrounding communities? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Go to the Premier.
Thank you. So there is a recognition that Yellowknife isn't the only part of the territory that needs assistance in this area. And so while this is the focus for the integrated services right now, we are looking at expanding to a number of regional centers. And so there is a plan to go out and we have been speaking with local Indigenous governments on this topic. Perhaps I can go to the Deputy Minister for some more specifics on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Premier. We'll go to Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, absolutely. Integrated service delivery is launched in Yellowknife. So that has been the primary vehicle for us to actually do a lot of the work in relation to this encampment. So that team has been instrumental in the work and I think is proving their value on a daily basis. Our plan under the homelessness strategy and in relation to integrated service delivery is to expand to other communities. So for example, Inuvik, Hay River, potentially Betchico. So we want to make sure that we're expanding our capacity to bring staff from various departments or agencies together to address issues related to homelessness. And then of course expand that beyond to other NGOs or other partners such as Indigenous governments. So that is all part of our plan going forward. So we're happy to carry on those conversations with partners as that plan starts to take shape. And I will say that, during the last government, there were extensive engagements with regions and Indigenous governments to lay some of the groundwork for this and to test interest. So we have a lot of valuable information already upon which we're using to help guide that work. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Go to Waylon Armstrong. Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, well, this is all related to the encampment. And further to what Premier said about eliminating the homelessness in the Northwest Territories. So there's about 44,000 people living in NWT. I would like to know how many of those people are homeless and which region they're from and the nationality. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Whelan Armstrong. Go to the Premier.
Thank you. We would also like to know a lot of that information. It is not something that is easy to gather, but there are efforts underway to actually collect that information now. So I suspect that the information we'll have in the, I won't say the near future, but hopefully sooner than later, will be probably more robust than we've ever had before in the territory. Thank you.
Thank you, Premier. I'll just ask one question. I've been hearing a lot about these programs that are being proposed. And all you hear is Yellowknife and the regional centers. I've stated before that you have to include the small communities directly. My chiefs know where all our people are. The mayor of Inuvik doesn't know where my neighbor is. So we have to, more of a statement than anything, we have to include the smaller communities. I'll go on to Mr. Morse. Do you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to follow up a bit more on the line of questioning I was using. There we go. Yeah, just following up again on the plan. I mean, this isn't so much a question, but during the budget time, during our most recent budget negotiations, MLA's brought forward a fairly ambitious proposal to significantly increase funding to NWT housing to help try to address this problem. We were told the funding's not needed. We were told that they've got quite a large surplus that they can spend. But it seems quite clear to me that we don't have a plan in place or a budget ask coming in the near future for addressing this issue. Despite I've heard the Premier say a number of times that we do need to be increasing housing. So I just want to hear back from the Premier and emphasize the need for. I am looking for them to come forward with an ask in the budget, with a plan in the budget for addressing this issue. That's, I guess, my question and statement.
Thank you, Mr. Morse. We'll go to the Premier.
Thank you. We are right now looking at gathering information to determine what type of resources will be needed. We are working to improve our relationships with NGOs to get a better sense of their operations and what they need. As the Deputy Minister stated earlier, there's a recognition that the NGOs have been working on shoestring budgets, which is, one of the things I always say about NGOs is that they do such great work for such a low cost, but we can't expect that that's the way that's always going to happen. And so we need to ensure that we are supporting them. So there will be more money that is needed. When that will come out, whether it's a supplementary appropriation, whether it's in the budgets, that is all yet to be determined. But what we're looking at here today is this this very urgent issue of the encampment in Yellowknife, and how do we address that urgent issue for these individuals. And as we've heard, there are opportunities, there are sheltering opportunities that are available, and we're working to make sure that those individuals can access those. That being said, yes, there is a need for more funding. I do not have a document that lays out all of the dollar amounts we'll need, where we would spend those, what they would be used for. That level of planning has not happened. We're at the beginning of that level of planning. Had this focus started at the beginning of the last government, we'd be in a position to answer that question, but this is still in its infancy. Thank you.
Thank you, Premier. We'll go to Mr. Hawkins. Do you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess it's a combination. I'll squeeze two questions into one. I understand there's a $30+ million surplus with housing that isn't being fulfilled or used for various and sundry reasons. My statement may be more specific to how do we leverage that and work with NGO partners to be able to access that money and get them working and building options. But at the very beginning, we mentioned capacity issues. Capacity issues are there for reasons. Capacity is there for a reason. It's defined for its merits, be it fire codes, staffing ratio, etc. So what specifically is the government doing to address the capacity issues, and what would that look like? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Go to the Premier.
So if we're talking about shelter capacity for NGOs, the number of spaces, so we are in talks with NGOs about how we can increase the number of shelter beds that they have, whether that is finding alternative space for alternative office space so that those offices can move out of the shelter and then those can be turned into beds. That's one option. And so those are active conversations that we are having with different organizations, and for more detail, perhaps Deputy Minister or who can hand it off if he wishes. Perhaps Katie Sue. Thank you.
Thank you, Premier. We'll go to Ms. Jericho.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For NGOs in general, in regards to capacity, depending on the NGOs, I think we see different needs from different NGOs, particularly when we see some NGOs having national support and other NGOs not having that national support. So we are really going case by case with NGOs and trying to build a really clear understanding of the capacity that they're looking for. We have been actively including NGO staff in GNWT frontline training that GNWT frontline staff are doing, so they're always included in that to ensure that they have kind of that same level of training. We have GNWT staff who are actively working on site with NGOs to support them both in building capacity and when sometimes they have staffing issues where there's just a lack of people. So, we do things case by case as they come up. We work with them to, we try to help them identify funding. There's various things that we do to support. Capacity it's a large issue, and each NGO has a different subset of needs, and so we do try to work with them specifically when asked. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jericho. We're coming to the conclusion of our presentation. Squeeze in a couple more questions. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just on this question of resourcing, so there's dedicated funding from the federal government, $250 million for rights-based community action plans to end homelessness encampments. I'm assuming we're accessing some of that money, but it does sound like there's a need for more resources. So are we expecting a supplementary appropriation to be brought forward in the fall for us to consider? Because I don't want to wait until next year if there's an urgent need for spending. So are we adequately resourced with that federal funding, or are we going to have to seek more internally? Because the feds have also challenged local governments to come up with to double that funding. So they're saying, we'll kick in, but we also need the territorial government to step up, and all provincial governments. So is there a plan to do that? Because clearly there's an urgent need for this level of investment. And if there's another mechanism like interdepartmental transfers, it would be helpful if we could know that the Premier and his ministry have the resources they need to be successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. We'll go to the Premier.
Thank you. We are seeking funding from Canada. The department just met with officials from the Government of Canada yesterday. But yes, more resources than what Canada is offering will be needed. We could get into the technical aspects of how funding is moved between departments, but the fact is we understand it's getting cold. We need to address this particular situation before it gets too cold, and we'll get the money one way or another. But I'm not banking on Canada coming to save the day and give us all the funding we need with this or any other issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Premier. Ms. Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question is around how do we currently and how could we better support people who are coming out of incarceration and often sort of just drop directly into homelessness. I've heard stories from the Salvation Army of how people coming out of jail are literally dropped at the door of the Salvation Army as soon as they get out of jail. What programs do we currently have to try to avoid that, or what is the plan to do things better to ensure that there is a pathway for people coming out of incarceration other than directly into homelessness in the shelter system? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Morgan. Premier?
Thank you. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes people might have a place to go outside of Yellowknife in their home community, but they prefer to actually stay in Yellowknife after leaving a correctional facility. But perhaps Katie Sue has more information on the specifics. But I will say that someone showing up at the shelter from corrections is, corrections is now, that part is done, right? So we're at a situation where someone is now in a shelter. And so we work with that person like we would work with other people who are at that shelter for whatever reason they came from, whether they came from corrections or anywhere else. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Premier. I'll go to Ms. Yakalai. Do you have a quick question?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Reid, do you have a question?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
I think it's it.
That's your question.
Oh, good. Oops. Okay, thank you for joining us today. This concludes today's public briefing on the encampment. Public proceedings have now concluded.